So to introduce our speaker, so Alberto Cavallo is Associate Professor at Harvard Business School. He is a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He is a member of the Bureau of Labour Statistics Technical Advisory Panel. His main research focuses on the behaviour of prices and the implications for macroeconomic policy. He co-founded the Billion Prices Project, which is a joint initiative between Harvard and MIT to utilise online data to conduct research on inflation measurement. And in the UK, we are trying to use web scrape and scanner data in the headline measures of inflation by 2023. So this is particularly interesting for us as an organisation. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Alberto, who flew in this morning, especially to give this presentation. Professor Cavallo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I feel especially fortunate to be talking in this environment because I am an economist who is obviously very interested in measurement, and I often find it frustrating that in some academic settings there's not so much research going on in terms of measurement. But I see ESCoE, ONS, and the UK community in general so interested in it that I'm just grateful to be invited and be able to collaborate. So I'm going to be describing a little bit the work that I do with alternative price data sources. In particular, I'm trying to answer here the question of whether big data can help improve macroeconomic statistics, which is what I focus on. And there, I've listed a few important economists who have written papers or notes about this topic and how exciting it seems to be that we have these new data sources and we can try to solve some of the problems of the macro data. But the truth is, we've had a ton of research in recent years. Many papers being presented in this conference are a testament to that. But I've seen relatively little impact in terms of production, what I call production in national statistical agencies. And I know there are so many challenges of actually implementing this in practice that I wanted to share some of my views based on my experience over the years. Now, in a nutshell, I'll tell you what it is, so then you can decide if you want to listen to the rest of my talk or not. But I think we can use big data in many ways to improve economic statistics. We could use it in terms of forecasting, anticipation. We could use it to build statistics that we couldn't build before, in ways we couldn't build before. I'm going to make the case that we should think of it mostly as a data collection opportunity, a way to improve the data we have. We don't necessarily need to change the way we produce the statistics or the models, the indices, the formulas, but rather we can focus on the fact that it's just increasing dramatically our ability to get better data sets. And the better the data, the better the measurement. That's going to be a little bit my takeaway here. So I want to make a few points first to just describe what the topics. I'm going to emphasize on what I call new technologies for data collection. They're not necessarily big. Okay, the data set doesn't have to be big, but we just have new ways of getting to the data that we didn't have before. Web scraping, all these alternative things you have been hearing about. And it's far more accessible than before. So I think that also explains a little bit the resurgence of some of the interest. It's no longer just the National Statistical Agency who can gather the resources needed to do this. And I think that's very exciting from many dimensions, but it allows a lot of people to get involved and participate of this process in academia or the private sector. Now, you probably heard of many data sources that can be used for macro measurement. We have the traditional surveys, and then all the ones that I'm listing below are new data sets that could be part of this big data field. I am going to focus on the last two, which is where I worked with online scrape data. which was how we started the Billion Prizes project about 10 years ago. And then finally, I'm going to show you some results we're getting experimenting with crowdsourced data for inflation measurement. In particular, I'm going to talk about measuring inflation in Venezuela, where there are no official statistics and there's nothing online today. So there's a good opportunity to experiment with crowdsourced inflation measurement. All right, so a little bit about the project. I don't know how many of you know about this, but let me just describe it briefly. It's an academic initiative we started about 10 years ago with the objective of collecting data from large retailers. We focused specifically on retailers that were large offline and also had an online presence. Our goal was to try to get to the same retailers that the traditional CPI measurements were getting to, and so we never really focused exclusively on online-only retailers. We're currently downloading about 25 million observations per day from roughly 1,000 retailers all over the world, and we cover 60 countries, but there's 20 countries of the world where we have enough data to be able to produce an equivalent all items CPI. And we've been doing this for several years. The methodology is relatively easy to describe. We use scraping technology. So this is software that visits the public websites of retailers that sell online. There's no hacking involved here. We just visit the public website. We look at the code automatically, just like Google would do when it's indexing those pages. And then we start building these daily data sets with everything we can find on that page on that day. So in principle, we're collecting all the goods that some of these companies sell on a very high frequency basis. And then we can use that raw data to build some statistics. You can find more information about the project on the link I'm showing below. Now, we actually started this because I'm from Argentina. Some of you may know that Argentina back in 2007 and 2008 was lying about inflation statistics. I can say that now freely because there's a new government. But basically, we said, well, can we use online data to measure inflation? And we realized we couldn't. Pretty quickly, we realized we could also use it in countries that were telling the truth. There were some advantages to doing this. So in 2010, we started creating a daily index for the US on the BPP website. Pretty soon, we realized the cost of collecting that much data, though it is lower than doing it the traditional way of physically visiting a store, was becoming quite large. And we saw also an opportunity to fund this continuously by creating a company that could collect the data and produce daily statistics. So that's what we did in 2011. We created PriceStats, which now collects the microdata, and the company publishes inflation statistics on a daily basis that usually anticipates what happens with the CPI in some of these countries. So there are people in the financial sector who buy these indices. And this has allowed us, this is actually an important thing for us to make sure that we could get this into production and keep on collecting this data on a larger and larger scale over the years. So there's a very complementary side also to the academic work that I do with this data. Now, technically, what does it mean when we do web scraping? We visit these public websites, and behind every page that you look at, there's usually this very structured code, and you can teach a software to identify these pieces of code, which stay roughly the same as long as the page look and feel doesn't change. It's a lot of work initially. You have to train the software, but after that, you can set it to run, and as long as the page remains roughly the same in terms of the look and feel, then the data automatically gets collected and stored in a database. Now, you can do this the hard way, by the way, by using Python or programming languages. And that's usually what I see people when they start doing web scraping. That's what they focus. But today, we actually have all these point-and-click solutions out there by commercial vendors. They will sell you software that all you have to do is supply the URL, click on the type of data you want, and they build the robot for you, and then that gets automatically processed. So if you're thinking of doing web scraping, I strongly advise you to follow that route rather than going through hard coding type of exercise, which in practice makes it much harder. I'm happy to talk more about that with anyone who wants. I wrote this paper in 2016 where we were explaining some of the advantages and disadvantages of using this type of data for inflation measurement together with Roberto Rigobon at MIT. We called it the Billion Prices Project. And I had this table where I would compare some of the advantages I saw for research and disadvantages of online data versus traditional data sources. And you can see, I obviously wanted to emphasize all the good things here. No? So we have this long list of low cost of observation, per observation, high data frequency. We could do this daily. We had all the retailers, so it was all the products in the retailer, so it was basically a census of all the data. But I want us to focus on what I labeled there as the bottom three are actually the main disadvantages I saw with this data, which is basically that we have relatively few product categories that are covered relative to what we see in CPI data. That's also a problem with scanner data, even worse with scanner data, but we were facing this issue. We always face it. Second, we have relatively few retailers covered. They're the ones that, they may be large retailers, but there's a few of them that are present online, and that's the ones that we can get to with this data. And finally, we didn't have any quantities of expenditure weights. So there was one thing I was missing here, and I realized it was a big concern for everybody I started talking to, which is whether the online price has anything to do with the offline price. We're visiting these websites for companies that sell in both places, and people would often question whether the price we were getting on the web was at all similar to the price of offline. So I'll get to that in a second. That's, I think, a question about the representativeness of the online data for retail transactions in general. Let me just say a few things about these things. First, quantities and expenditure weights. I don't see that as a big problem because we have the other data sets telling us basically the weights of the basket. We can use the CPI, or potentially we could use data sources like scanner data to give us weights in higher frequency. So that's not a big issue. The one about retailers, it depends a little bit on the country. There are some countries where the retail sector is so concentrated on a few retailers that if you just gather data from those, you can get basically all you need. And then product categories is obviously a concern if you're trying to build an aggregate CPI, but that doesn't mean that you cannot build good estimates for the sectors that are well represented online. And the good news is over the years, more and more of these sectors get covered online. So I want to show you a little bit of data on that. These are some of the statistics we generate. You're looking always in this side. It's always an all-item CPI. And we get the sort of things you would expect. In more developed countries where the online and offline sectors are more tightly integrated and they compete more with each other, we're able to get results that are quite similar to the official CPI. In some developing countries where you could expect the online sector to be quite particular, it's harder to get a match there. And that is also reflecting the fact that, for example, in Brazil or in China, we may not be able to cover as much of the whole basket of the CPI online as we do in the case of the US and the UK. And then when you look at the sectors, some things are maybe not bought online, but there's very good information online, like fuel, food, electronics is bought online a lot, and we get really close matches over there. And naturally, when you think of the USA medical care, sorry, that's cut there, that's when we get big differences often, because there are some services that we cannot capture at all. Okay? Now, as I said before, over the years, this gets better and better. And I don't see that as a very long-term problem. In fact, I wanted to show you here, one of the things you can do if you're thinking of building an index like this is say, I'm just going to use online data for the sectors that I can monitor directly, and then I'm going to use traditional CPI data collection for the rest. So what I'm showing you here is how would that change the way we measure things and the results we get. When you're looking at the orange line there, that's the index that only uses online data. And the black line is the CPI. And then the purple bluish line is the one where we are actually replacing, using the CPI for the sectors that we cannot monitor directly. And you can see here, it doesn't really, at this stage, at least for countries like the US, or I'm going to show you for countries, I think I have the UK here, it does make a difference in nailing and getting right those particular levels. It certainly improves when you incorporate these new sectors, but it's not a major concern at this stage. More important, I think, a bigger challenge, and when I talk to statistical agencies, I notice this is their main worry, is what are we really getting when we get that price online? Are we getting just that 10% of the retail sector that is supposed to be taken online, or are we also getting something that is very representative of offline transactions? So that's what I want to spend most of my time today. Are these online prices representative of retail transactions? The people that say no, I didn't mean that as a joke, but it's good. People that say no, they say, well, online sales are still less than 10% of retail trade in most countries. So from that perspective, this is a small thing. We shouldn't maybe even pay attention to this that much. Then there's actually evidence that online retailers tend to have different pricing behaviors. And Sasha Talavera has a paper with Yuri Godnichenko where he has documented several papers where they have documented using online comparison websites that much of it is online-only retailers, but they do find the pricing behaviors are different from what we tend to find in retailers that are sampled for the CPI. So that's another reason why we might think there's a potential difference there. Now, some evidence for yes, some tentative evidence would be the case that we have this co-movement that I showed you on these online indices that we produce. So we are capturing sort of the same type of dynamics. And then there's the simple idea that, in essence, the online store today is effectively the largest store of many of these retailers. For example, Walmart, it says last year, but I don't know if that means 2016 by now. But they had 5,000 stores in the US. Each store had 0.02% of the sales. If you get to the online store, you get 8%. So if you're going to sample any store, the online one is a good bet. But of course, there are deeper questions. There could be other biases that are introduced, differences in level, even if there are no differences in changes or inflation. So I think this is the question that needs to be answered. And if I were a statistical agency deciding to switch between visiting a physical store and doing this online, I need more information on this question. Are the prices we get online different from what we get at the physical store? And I'm also going to show you some evidence, not only online, offline, but also what happens within different stores where we can gather this data and how that is changing. That's what I want to focus on now. So I wrote this paper eventually after getting so many referee reports that said, oh, the online prices are very different from what we get in stores. I said, I need to show whether this is true or not. And I ran this very large-scale comparison of online and offline prices. I tried to get access to CPI data, and of course, there's a lot of statistical secrecy behind it. So I said I have to do this myself. And we came up with this idea where we developed an app that we gave people to download on their phones. We paid them. Actually, we hired freelancers, and we said you have to download an app and go to any of the stores that we tell you. You pick 10 random products, and all you have to do is basically just scan the barcode, take a picture, and enter the price. And that information gets sent to us, and on the same day, or actually within 7 days, we would scrape for the online price. So we're looking, just to be clear, within retailer. I want to know if the price that I get for Walmart online is the same one we would get at a random offline store. That's the thing we were doing here. So we took 50 retailers in about 10 countries. And again, just to be clear, what am I talking about? I'm talking about that intersection between the retailers that sell in both locations, not the online only, okay? What I call multi-channel. Here you have the list of retailers. In the UK, we did Asda, Marks and Spencer, Sainsbury's, and Tesco. We did a lot more in the US. And we tried to get some of the largest retailers in some of these other countries. And this is basically just showing you how much data we were able to collect. 56 retailers in total, about 38,000 observations that were simultaneously online and offline. And this one is actually showing the results. So I'm just going to focus on this third column. That's the share of identical prices in each one of these comparisons that we got. And there are obviously differences across countries, but on average, what we found is that around 70% of the time, prices were identical, 72% of the time if you look at all of them. The UK was actually quite high, 91% of the time. When there's a difference, oh, by the way, I have to say Brazil is quite different. So if you're from Brazil, I would love to talk to you and understand a little bit better why. And the same thing happens with Japan. But in the rest of the countries, we tend to have relatively high levels of matching. When there is a difference, we do tend to find that there are lower prices online, which is what you would also tend to expect. Now, if you take into account even those differences, on average, you get very little difference at all. No? So not only most of the times they're identical, when they are different, the differences themselves are actually quite small. So from that perspective, it is quite similar. Now, it's interesting when you look at different sectors. We get nearly identical prices when we look at clothing, which is purchased online a lot, and you can argue there's a very tight integration between the online and offline market. And then when we look at food, that's when we get most of the difference, okay? And this is online and offline. We actually get the same sort of results when we're looking at different offline locations. By the way, if you are buying online food, you are actually paying more in many of these locations. I don't know, that could be in some cases because they're trying to hide shipping costs that they're not explicitly charging in many of these situations. Very good. So price changes actually have a different timing, but we found them to be roughly similar in terms of frequency and size. In fact, what we found is that online, many of these retailers were making their price changes online sooner, and then eventually they did the same thing offline. So the time series look exactly the same, it's just a little bit anticipated online. Now, people often ask me, wait a second, how do you know they were not showing you online the same price, but then based on your IP location or your browsing habits, you were getting something different from someone else? So I actually did a few simulations about this with 2 US retailers. We did some IP-based pricing, scraping the same products from different IP addresses, or persistently browsing the same pages, and we always got the same results. So there was not much evidence that they were doing any online price discrimination and hiding it in this sort of way. There are more differences between retailers. You would expect that, no? I was showing you results within Walmart. You can say, well, what about the price of a TV between Walmart and Amazon? That's when you find most of the price dispersion that people have documented in the literature before. But it is surprising that nearly 40% of the times we sampled a product sold by Walmart, it actually had the exact same price as Amazon. So this was an indication that there was a lot more competition going on between, and price matching going on between some of these companies. And if you read reports about the latest trends in their pricing strategies, they do acknowledge that they're monitoring each other a lot more than they did in the past. And that, by the way, is done through web scraping. I have a lot of evidence to show you of how pervasive this phenomenon is. There are some online retailers that, for example, ask you for zip code before showing you the price of a good. No? Most retailers don't do that online, but some supermarkets do. Even those supermarkets tend to have, if you look at all the products, around 40% of the products just have a single price in 45 zip codes. This is one of the largest supermarkets in the US. So there's even those that can and have the ability to do this do not differentiate. We even found this type of behavior across countries. So if you focus on global retailers like Apple, IKEA, it turns out that when they have to show their prices in the same currency, the price differences between, for example, Austria, and this is always compared to the US, basically collapses. There's no price. Sorry, this is not versus the US. This is versus, I think, Spain. We were comparing the price dispersion within Europe. So we were looking within currency unions. It also happens between the US and El Salvador, for example. When these companies have to show prices in the same currency, the price differences tend to disappear. We started questioning why could this be the case? Why is there so much uniform pricing in their policies across locations when they certainly have the technology today to differentiate and price discriminate as much as they want? There's evidence also offline, not only online. I want to call your attention to this paper by De La Viña and ESCoE. They find evidence using scanner data in the US of uniform pricing. Now, they attribute it to the fact that there may be a high managerial decision cost. And they say the reason they're not setting different prices in Boston than in New York is that it's just so hard to decide. No? But that's a little bit puzzling when you think of it online. These companies now have all these algorithms. They have all this data about our purchasing habits. Why are they not customizing this better? They could even customize on many demographic dimensions. No? Interestingly, Aten and Rigmi have this paper. They use Israeli scanner data, and they use this event where some of the supermarkets in Israel were forced to show their prices on the websites, and then they saw a dramatic reduction in the price dispersion across locations. So there seems to be some indication that transparency and having to post your prices on the web reduces dramatically some of this dispersion. So I started wondering to what extent is this uniform pricing that we see today. Now, by the way, I'm going to talk about the measurement implications in a second, but they are important if you think of data collection. How much of this was an Amazon effect? There's a word that a lot of people are throwing out there now. How much is Amazon really changing the retail landscape? And in particular, it could be affecting, through its competition, much of these behaviors that affect measurement. So I actually wrote a new paper called More Amazon Effects, where I was trying to document whether online competition was affecting pricing behaviors. Okay? And in particular, I focus on two things that I think are important for measurement. One is I noticed that there was a significant increase in the frequency of price changes. It was becoming a lot more common for some of these companies to change prices every 3 months instead of every 9 months, which is important if you're thinking of the frequency that we tend to collect price data. And then I noticed there was an increase in uniform pricing as well. At least it's hard to document the increase because I don't have that much geographical data over time. But if you look at it today, there's a massive amount of uniform pricing within these retailers. So what some of the reasons, and this is a little bit speculative, you may be interested, there's a lot of evidence that they're using algorithmic pricing. So that's how they're using big data themselves. They have information on their costs changing all the time. They can see demand. And there's this ability that they have of monitoring their competitors more closely. So on the time series, they are price discriminating a lot. And that's the higher frequency that we observe. And apparently, customers don't seem to care that much about that. We're OK that they're doing this. Now, when you think across locations, for some reason, they're not able to apply these same technologies. I link it more to the fact that there's online transparency, and they're concerned about the fairness aspect of this, whether people will understand that it is OK and reasonable for them to have different prices across locations. Okay? So 2 things I want to point out. Not only is this suggesting, or the paper suggests, if you read it, that online and offline pricing behaviors are becoming more integrated, but both of these dimensions matter for measurement, so I'll make that point. Let me go quickly through this one, which is less important. This is just showing you the frequency of price changes over time in the US, how it has changed. The interesting thing here is if you looked at the 2008-2009 time period, the levels of frequency of adjustment with around 15% of prices changing every month was roughly similar, or it implied a duration of 9 months, which is what we had found in the academic literature that was the normal thing for CPI. Now, eventually, today in the US, we get around 30% of prices changing every month, which implies 3 to 4 months of a duration of prices. That's actually the number that was documented for online-only retailers back in 2012. So the two seem to have converged. And in fact, it's been the multi-channel retailers that are starting to mimic a lot the behavior of the online-only retailers. more important for the question of measurement, and the point I wanted to make today is this idea of uniform pricing. I essentially replicated some of the things I had done in the previous paper, but this time I wanted to test on a much larger scale the behavior of Amazon and compare it to these traditional retailers. So I took Amazon, I took Walmart, I took Safeway, and I took Best Buy, leaders in the US in each of these categories. And basically what we did is build a robot that would visit a product's page for Walmart, and then, this is Amazon, and then just change the zip code and see the price that we will get. And we run this on a loop, high-frequency loop for each one of these retailers and each one of 100 zip codes that we could find with a big difference in unemployment. We measured price dispersion in two ways. We looked at bilateral comparisons and calculated the share of identical prices and the average price difference between locations. And that's what you're seeing there. Let me just look at this number for a second. This is basically telling you that 91% of the times we made a bilateral comparison of two zip codes in Amazon, we find the prices to be identical. Now, if you look at other retailers that are bunched together in this column, it's a little bit lower, but still 78% of the time, prices are identical across zip codes. Zip codes that have significant differences in unemployment and significant differences in economic conditions all over the US. And the average price difference is sort of the same scenario. So bottom line, when you look at these numbers, Amazon and online-only retailers tend to have even less price dispersion, more uniform pricing, but the traditional retailers are not that far behind. What's interesting when you look at sectors is that in electronics, it's identical all the time. Most of the differences, again, appear when we look at food and beverages, which is, I believe, reasonable because for two reasons. Maybe some people understand there could be a reason why it's costlier in some regions to deliver food than in others, and so that reduces this antagonization type of effect. And by the way, it's a very traditional type of pricing for supermarkets, so people may be used to experiencing that. Okay. The other point I wanted to make is you can actually look at Walmart and say, I'm going to identify the goods in Walmart that are sold on Amazon. You take the product description, you search for it on Amazon. Amazon tells you if they can find the exact same good. So you can look at that set of goods and compare it to goods that cannot be found on Amazon. And what happens there is that uniform pricing actually increases when a good is found on Amazon. So that's how I link it to online competition in the paper. So I think that's happening to some extent because of that. And by the way, the effect of being found on Amazon is equivalent to a 10% unemployment rate different across locations. So it is a significant effect. You would need it to be quite high for this to disappear. So as I mentioned, why is this happening? Why is it that the same technology that enables them to make all this price discrimination in the time series is not being used for the geographical price discrimination? I link it mostly to this reality that consumers just don't like to know that they're being charged a different price for exactly the same good by exactly the same retailer at the same time. And it can be legal, technologically feasible, but if you talk to some of these companies, they say, we just fear we'll get an article in the press that exposes our price discrimination behavior, and this will be tremendously costly. And it's actually quite easy to find examples of this in newspapers. One of the earliest examples was actually Amazon, who tried to price discriminate with the prices of CDs. They were experimenting with different prices, and somebody realized, Jeff Bezos came out and says, we are never going to experiment again or on demographics. So he actually imposed a big constraint on the company. Best Buy is an interesting case. It turns out Best Buy used to have different prices online and offline. Some people were complaining. They were showing up with their phones and saying, you guys are selling the same good at a different price. So someone had this idea, why don't we just put a computer in the store so people can check the prices? And it seemed to work for a while. But guess what happened? When you checked that computer, it was connected to the internal database of the store. It wasn't the online price. Soon enough, somebody figured that out, and there was a scandal. So Best Buy, if you look today, I mean, all these tests we run, Best Buy is one of those retailers that has exactly the same price in all the channels where they sell. So this is the sort of articles I think some of these companies are so afraid of, okay? So what are the measurement implications? First of all, high frequency of price changes raises questions about monthly sampling. I think it will get to the point where if you go and get the price at the 15th of the month, you may be getting a very particular price. It's just so volatile that next month you may not getting in sale, and that can create a lot of short-term volatility. It would be better if you could sample it more frequently and just take an average for the month. That would be my impression. I don't think it's such a big issue right now. I do think this is more important. If this is so pervasive, if we have this uniform pricing in these large retailers, just one store is all we need. So many statistical agencies spend money visiting many Walmarts, many Targets, many Best Buys, when in the end they're always getting the same price for the same good. So my claim here is there's no need to visit so many locations. By the way, you can do it online because the online and offline prices are the same. And I'm not saying your budget needs to be reduced. I'm just saying let's use those resources for those sectors that are much harder to measure, no? Or increase frequency, which would help with the one on top. All right. So that's my takeaway. And as, in terms of representativeness, I just want you to remember these online and offline markets are becoming so integrated that even if relatively few sales are made online, we can use the web to get to the offline prices. So think of it as a different technology to do the exact same data collection and capture the same data points. I think that's an important thing that is sort of needs to be understood for this type of thing to increase in terms of actual production. Now, I have several other projects. I'm obviously not going to bore you with all of them. I wanted to show you a little bit about the results we get with crowdsourcing, because it's another example of how you can use these new technologies to collect roughly the same data we are used to collecting today for the CPI. But again, we're using a new technology to supplement the approach. So this is the question I'm trying to ask and answer. Can we crowdsource inflation measurement? I'm focusing on Venezuela for the reasons that you see here. There's no CPI since 2015. There's no online data. We were actually collecting data online, but in 2015 or 14, I think the last retailer that we had disappeared. Interestingly, Chavez in Venezuela was telling the truth about inflation at the time. So we were getting really good estimates or close estimates to the CPI, but it just disappeared. The IMF, nobody really knows what inflation is today in Venezuela. The IMF has this way of estimating the inflation rate by looking at the black market exchange rate and assuming PPP, so a full pass-through, and they get to these estimates of 1.3 million% for 2018, which, you know, to some extent, having 100,000 or a million is not really, you know, it's chaos anyway, no? But there's a lot of uncertainty whether this even makes any sense. There are some local private efforts by economists locally that are trying to send people to the stores and replicate what the statistical agency would do, but they face all these fines and criminal charges. So we tried to see if we could do this with the same methodology we had used for online-offline comparisons and hire freelancers to go about and do this. So we have this website called Inflación Verdadera, which means real inflation. This is where we started tracking things in Argentina, so now we added a section on Venezuela. We had this really catchy video where we were trying to get volunteers. I don't know if I can play this, but it's actually fun. We made this video where we're, let's see. See, we're saying, look, if you're worried about inflation in Venezuela, you want to show the truth about inflation in your country, download the Yes app. You put this code in. Just go to a store. We made it super happy. No? You go, you click a new collection. And by the way, the app was something that was already out there. We just asked the developer to, he had developed it for an inventory management type of project. And we said this could be just used for exactly what we need. So that's how we thought this would work. And then we waited for volunteers, but we failed tremendously. Nobody signed up. It turns out that You know, if you live in a country that is in such a chaotic situation, there are not that many people interested in helping with inflation measurement. But the fact that we had to do this so easy so that we could get volunteers meant that we could just hire freelancers and they would have no trouble understanding what they had to do. And that's what we did. We ended up hiring 50 workers in app work. And we weren't sure if they were going to be reliable or not. No? Because in essence, what we were trying to do is replace a very well-trained labor force that normally goes out there and collects all these prices with these freelancers that had no idea what they were doing. So the app was restricting their ability to do weird stuff. It was asking them to just pick the same good, take the picture, and then we validated. By the way, we're correcting 500 prices every week in 10 cities. No, you don't want to see the video again. We're using sort of, in terms of methodology, very off-the-shelf type of technology. I want to emphasize that. The app was, as I mentioned, something someone else had developed for something else. The data gets sent via email. When it gets into our Gmail, then we have this thing called Zapier that I don't know if you've heard about, but basically you can have this rule that it looks at your Gmail all the time, and if it finds some Excel files, it will store it in your Dropbox. So this is all mostly free or very low cost. And then we have a Stata program that you can check if you want to. We posted everything online. It loops through these files, cleans the data, and just computes a regular price index. And we have all the data online. One of our concerns was that how do we even know if the people are sending us valid prices when they input them? So we are actually using other freelancers through Mechanical Turk, which is a platform that Amazon has, where you can pay them a few cents to fill up a survey, and then we just ask them to tell us what the price is, and we can get this, like 10 freelancers to give us the answer on a single picture, and then statistically we know if it looks that the original freelancer was inputting the right prices or not. So that's an easy way of getting cross-validation. When we started, we were actually getting results that were much lower than the estimates at the time. This is just showing you the monthly inflation rate in Venezuela in 2017. These numbers are super high for any country, but they were relatively low from what we were experiencing. And now things have changed dramatically in the last year when Venezuela has really gone out the situation is out of control, and you can see monthly inflation reaching 800%. So some of these events and ups and downs are correlated or have some relationship to political events and economic events that were taking place in Venezuela at the time. So it seems to be providing us with relatively good information at relatively low cost. And the numbers are, if I were to calculate the annual inflation rate, much lower than what you would get with the estimates. Interestingly, I should mention the price tag photos are changing. So I actually remember when I was a kid in Argentina, we went to a hyperinflation, and they got to the point that nobody showed prices at all in the stores. They would just get a list of printed list of prices, the cash register, and then you would try to get there before the new list appears. And I've seen this process developing in Venezuela. First, they stopped putting the prices on the shelves, and they would just have these machines that they would have to scan the good and change the prices. And afterwards, we're starting to get just written price tags. And lately, no price tag at all. No? But I like that picture because it also shows the state of some of the produce that these people are getting is disastrous. So at least as a visual record, I think it's also very interesting information. But the point I want to make is this is doable. And I mean, we didn't know until we actually took it into production. And that's one of the points I wanted to make. You know, we do these things in academic settings often, and it's a very controlled environment. In academics, we like to, if there's data that we don't like, we don't use it. And then we use something else that works. No? But when you actually have to produce something and get these results and people are paying attention, that's when you realize the complexity of getting that you have to solve to take it into production. So there are some other challenges that I thought I could briefly mention. I promised I would mention them briefly in my description of the talk. And they relate to what I've shown you already. there's not only the issue of representativeness that I think is disappearing, but there's just so many technological skill gaps often when you're thinking of taking this into production. My impression after using this for so long, and I mentioned this at the beginning, is just don't overcomplicate things. Don't look for an expert in scraping. That's usually the worst thing you can do, because that expert will produce a script in Python that no one else will understand. And when that expert charges you more, then the new person has to write it all over again, and it becomes chaotic. I think one of the nice things of what is happening with all these new big data technologies is that there are companies developing toolkits or solutions that are very intuitive and very easy to use. So I mentioned the point-and-click scraping software, but if you think of the crowdsourcing environment, we could do all this in ways we couldn't have done even 5 years ago, simply because all these extra freelancer and automation tools are available there. In terms of data messiness that people talk about all the time, this may be obvious, but the truth is you don't need to use it all. I see a lot of people eager to get access to these massive data sets, and then just the sheer size of it makes it impossible to know what to use, how to use it. So just remember, you don't have to use it all. Know the questions beforehand. If you just look at a data set and you say, what can I answer with this? It's gonna take a lot longer. And I would argue, if there's anything that's weird in the data, imagine you get a data set from someone and say, oh, it has so many holes. Let me come up with, for example, an index that tries to solve for these holes. And that's a valid approach, and I get it. But then see if you can actually improve the data collection. I think it's something we often don't pay attention to. We think it's not our job, or it's not that something else is in charge of that. And it's just the wrong approach. I would focus on how I can use the new technologies to improve the data collection. And then, as I said before, try to move whatever you're doing to a production experimental setting soon. Academic research is no substitute for what we are now calling in business schools active learning. So I think it also applies to the measurement statistics. Final remarks, I just want to argue big data, to me, is a huge measurement opportunity because we have these new technologies for data collection. For research, it's great because it also allows us to build customized data sets that fit our specific needs. I love this quote by Spigrilges. It's an old quote. He wrote a paper many years ago highlighting the problem that I think we can now solve. He sort of talked about the uneasy alliance between economists. Well, actually, he was talking about econometricians, but we can extend it to economists and data, and said, we have just shown very little interest in improving the data and getting involved with these details. We work with found data that someone else has produced for some other reason, and then we have to come up with these econometric techniques to deal with it. And true, in the past, there may not have been many opportunities to get involved in that grabby task, but I think big data gives us that opportunity, and not only statisticians working in statistical agencies, but academics and people in the private sector. So from my perspective, that is why this is so exciting. And if we have this better data collection, we're going to have better measurement, okay? And in particular, there are two sources that I think you should seriously consider in your work. One is online price data. It has advantages that I have explained in many of my papers. And then I think there's a lot of promise in crowdsourced data, particularly in some countries like Venezuela. We may have countries in Africa that could benefit greatly as well from this. And even in developed countries, it may be a good way for us to capture some services and other categories of goods that are simply hard to measure or collect data with more traditional techniques. Okay? So I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So we have roughly 25 minutes for questions. When asking a question, please can you state your name and organization? So I'd like to open the floor for questions for Professor Cavallo. Sorry, Sanjeev?
you correlated behaviours online versus what we've been traditionally collecting offline. And I think it's almost surprising, the correlations. And some of them, I think, are counterintuitive, i.e. where is the benefit of the online, the productivity, the efficiency gains, etc. And actually, it's comparable in many ways as you're describing, which I think is a very surprising issue. So 2 quick questions. Firstly, have you delved into the richness of your data to delineate the price that's been shown versus the price that's been charged or paid? So obviously discounting, you can go to a store, this week is 2 for the price of 1, next week is 3 for the price of 2, and then there's no discounting for a certain period, and then there is. And online, that happens as well. You can, just when you thought you were going to buy one product, pops up the screen for half a price. If you want, you can buy another. So have you done any work in that aspect? And my second question is, have you delved into other industries where I think maybe the online behavior is different from the retail? So for example, airlines, transport industries, rail, etc. They have a very different cyclical nature. As you get close to your journey, the prices go up. But if you bought it literally a day earlier, you might get a substantial reduction, but it's not called a discount. It's the actual price that's displayed and you are paying for. And then the competition with other competitors is very different. So the differential aspect for those type of industries.
Right. Thank you. Very good questions. Let me go to the first one. What I can observe by collecting data online are all those discounts that apply to everyone. So those type of promotions, 2 by 1 or discounts in prices, for example, it's data that I can collect and then I can use it. I've done it in the same paper where I compare online and offline behaviors. I've tested to see if sometimes the price differences that I get online and offline are driven by differences in sales online and offline. And to some extent, that is true. The sales online are not necessarily correlated with sales offline. Just as I think, sales are used a lot for inventory management. So if you were to look at 2 offline retail stores for the same retailer, you would get them to be timed at different times. But the behavior, like the frequency, the size of sales, the size of discounts, are actually quite similar. So on that dimension, the pricing behavior has also been quite integrated. The other thing, the one thing I cannot observe is how many people buy at the sale price. Or imagine you get coupons that are personalized sales discounts. And if over time we get more coupon use, then that could create a bias between what I can observe. Now, I would argue that's something that traditional data collection of CPI would also not be able to capture. So it's not a particularly disadvantage from that perspective. But it is an interesting dimension to consider. On your second question, sorry, I forgot the idea. The second
different
part?
Cyclical nature of pricing, charged, pricing paid for industries like rail, air transport, airlines, etc.
So I think you're absolutely right. What I'm describing here, this integration, this uniformity, for example, of geographical pricing, I think this applies to the retail sector in consumer goods. And it's far stronger in electronics and apparel than it is in food. Airlines are a completely different story. Many of these arguments that online retailers are discriminating a lot and using these algorithms to discriminate actually come from observations in the airline industry. Yuri Gorodchenko has a paper on documenting this. Were you a co-author there? Yes, you were a co-author as well. So they actually document a lot of dynamic pricing. With Sasha Talavera, they document a lot of dynamic pricing in the airline industry. Now, that's a sort of dynamic or time series price discrimination that I'm already observing here. But I think you're right. The problem is, though, let me just make one comment there. When online data started to become available, many people thought, great, we can use it to get better measurement of airlines, which is so hard to measure. My impression was that was the wrong approach, because that's not where the value of this really is. The value is in those other sectors that where we are getting that similarity between the offline and online, and then we can just use it as a tool to get to the same data we were getting before. But airlines are certainly one dimension where these things could change. And I do document across sectors also significant differences. And part of my research questions now are trying to understand how much that and why. Why do we observe these differences between Japan and the US, or between food and electronics? No?
Yeah, Peter van der Ven, OECD. Great presentation, very entertaining, thank you. But I try to get my head around what exactly this means for CPI measurement as official statistics. And I can see that we have to make much more use of web scraping techniques to collect data easily, the big data easily. But when it comes to, for example, what you say about the one store pricing behavior, I'm a bit wondering. Does it mean that we have to get away from representative price collection? Because what is true today may not be true in 5 years' time. So
right.
I'm wondering how you think about that kind of.
No, I think, for example, if I were a statistical agency, I would run these validations by retailer quite often to see if that still remains to be the case. I think you're right. The landscape is changing, and we don't know how it will evolve. You know? But I think there's an opportunity to simplify and use these tools. And I would urge people that are thinking of using big data for actual production of price indices not to think of this as a particular sector that needs particular price indices, but rather think of it as, can we use the technology to do better what we were traditionally doing? You know? And there's so much knowledge. I mean, all I've done, if you look at this, is I have collected data and relied on all this knowledge that has been developed for so long on how to construct price indices. I haven't innovated on the way we construct price indices. I do have ideas on how we can make easier quality adjustment where we observe all the prices that are available with unsearched spells. There are so many dimensions that we could go to, but the basic one is I think we need to improve that data collection and in whatever we can save on the data collection of electronics and apparel and all these things, you should be putting those resources to measure those categories that are so hard to measure.
Thanks so much. Peter Sinclair, University of Birmingham. Muchísimas gracias por la presentación. It was very, very interesting.
No, let's do this in Spanish so no one understands.
I'd just like to ask about price discrimination, because there are two different stories. Some say that price discrimination is outrageous, and there are models that point that way. But in general, economics says perfect price discrimination can have all sorts of benefits. Taxing the people with lower elasticities of demand, who may well be rich anyway, and encouraging a more efficient allocation of resources from price-making firms. So if there's pressure as a result of this work to accede to the idea that justice requires a uniform price over price, space and time, there could be quite a large welfare cost.
Right, I agree. So I'm not making any welfare claims here. It could make sense for us to want some of these retailers to be able to lower prices in areas that have higher unemployment than you would want from a welfare perspective to say that. I'm just talking about the reality of what I observed from their pricing. They seem to be constrained, and there's this lack of understanding in many of the customers of why a retailer may have to charge a different price. I showed you some results across countries. There are some very valid reasons. There are different VAT tax rates between countries that have the euro, no? And the retailers could simply say, look, I'm just charging you a different 3% more because there's 3% more VAT tax in France or whatever. But to the extent that that is not easy to communicate to clients, and clients can now detect this price change differences so easily. Often it's not the clients, but someone will figure it out. There will be a research paper documenting this and an article in the press. That is a constraint for these companies. I don't know how it will evolve. Like, for example, maybe Amazon gets us, just as they got us used to this high frequency of price changes over time, they maybe get us as consumers used to the fact that there are different prices across different locations. Just like Uber, think of Uber. I don't know if you had that impression. When Uber came about and did dynamic pricing, I initially felt antagonized by the fact that I thought a taxi should always be the same, and they were taking advantage of me during the reign. No? Even though I'm an economist, and I could see that. But I'm just exaggerating, but the customers felt that way. Now, everyone today probably understands why this dynamic pricing makes sense. So we may be going in that direction. I don't know.
There's a lady at the back that would like to ask a question. And we'll take the next question from the gentleman at the front.
Okay.
Hi. Thanks again for the very interesting, informative presentation. I was wondering how much your results are affected by the fact that, for example, you picked up the largest retailers in the UK, Tesco, Sainsbury's, and is it Marks & Spencer's? Or first of all, is a category of retailers, and second, they might collude, and also they are old players on the market. So perhaps the effect of the online sales has taken place already.
Right.
And also, going back, sorry, if I had one thing, to the first question, the size of the organizations you're looking at, I'm sure there will be a lot of heterogeneity. They micro-subsidize their activities online and offline because they are giant. They are the Carter in a sort, or the large organization. Whether this affects the fact that you might find no differences online and offline.
In that paper called the Amazon effect, one of the things I did was measure the pass-through from shocks. I argued there that I was interested in this question on whether the fact that they change prices more often, but they also have these national pricing policies, meant that they were more sensitive and would pass through the shocks they were getting into consumer prices faster. And I did find that. No? Now, when you measure the same thing with the CPI, you do detect in the US an increase in pass-through, but it's not as large. My explanation is exactly what you're saying. I think I'm looking at a subset of retailers that are greatly affected by the Amazon effect. These are exactly the type of companies that are having to deal with this online competition. So I'm seeing their behavior that does not apply to many retailers that are sampled for the CPI that are not facing that online competition. But then again, I mean, then the question becomes, do we need to sample those other retailers, and why? What are we getting there that we're not getting from the large retailers? For example, if you look at the aggregate indices I'm producing, it doesn't really seem to matter that we're not sampling those other retailers in many of these countries. In some of them do. In some countries do. So it's a question of how much spending is actually done in those locations, but also how different the pricing behaviors really are between the small ones and the large ones in the end. Yeah.
Further question at the front?
Thanks very much. Great talk, Alberto. So this is related to just that point about different outlets. So when we think about differences in prices across outlets, one of the things we traditionally think about is spatial monopolies for a reason why they're different prices. With online sales, of course, there's no sort of spatial aspect there. It's the same price offered to everyone regardless where they are. So does it matter? Does the spatial monopoly thing matter? Do stores within the same chain offer dramatically different prices? So a few years ago with a collaborator, Lorena Vancic, in 2013, we had a paper which looked at this for using scanner data from Australian supermarkets within one metropolitan area. We had 4 supermarket chains.
In Australia?
In Australia, yeah.
Right.
4 supermarket chains, 2 large, 2 small. And we could identify differences in prices across those stores. So we found that for the large chains, pricing was very consistent. So you could argue perhaps the way they exercise their market power is through their brand rather than their spatial location.
Right.
The smaller, so they're really controlled, so the managers really had no discretion over pricing. But the smaller chains, the stores had significant control over prices.
Yeah.
And that could be because maybe they're located near one of these stores from the bigger chains. So the conclusion we had was that if statistical officers want to do price sampling, they can only need to go to one of the stores within the big chains.
So you discovered this before me.
Well, it's complementary, I think.
Okay.
But then they should target their price sampling at the smaller stores where there's significant differences.
Right.
So I'm kind of concerned that you say, well, just use online prices, and because it's kind of the same. I'm worried that you're going to miss a lot that's going on that's important.
I think it's super important for us to think, what is the question we're trying to answer? There may be some questions where we don't need to sample those more particular retailers. But imagine you're looking at a country where the large retailers that I can observe online are only present in the large cities, and we're missing the picture of the small cities. And you're interested, for some measurement reason, to focus there. You think if you're measuring inflation, that it will be different from what you would observe. Australia is certainly one of the countries where I would argue the geographical differences should matter a lot. No? So there I would be less inclined. And I'm not suggesting that this should be the only way or only source of data. I may be clear on that. I think you should always, when you're thinking of these data sources, think of the advantages and disadvantages and the question you're trying to ask. And in some situations, I guess my simplest point is the following. If you're trying to get data from electronics, I don't see any reason to not do it online today. Because everywhere I've looked, electronics have the same price. I think it's the fact that those spatial monopolies have been broken by the transparency of the web. I mean, 30 years ago, Walmart could have a different price in Boston than in San Francisco. Nobody could even tell. Today, we can tell. I am not probably going to go to San Francisco, but certainly the fact that I can observe it has imposed this constraint. It has changed that. So that's a little bit my point. Let's focus on the easy to get apples here, and that's one dimension where it could work.
Question there. If anyone would like to ask a further question, we've got time for one, possibly two after this, so please raise your hand.
Paul Mizzen, University of Nottingham. I wonder how much the price comparison websites drive the uniformity result that you're finding, particularly on big ticket items, airline, insurance products, and so on. And then that leads us to the question, what about the coverage of those price comparison websites and their usage?
So, if you look at price comparison websites, there are typically comparisons between different retailers. And there are papers documenting that price dispersion has not fallen there. So in the early 2000s, people thought the web is going to allow us to compare prices from different retailers and reduce the price dispersion. That has not happened for several reasons. Some retailers may put some goods at a lower price, others at a higher price, or there's a lot of search cost involved, even though you can observe it on a price comparison website. I am focusing more on the within retailer price dispersion. And I think what the technology there is not a price comparison website, but rather the fact that we now carry all these phones with us. We may be at Walmart and we can check very easily what is the price of Walmart. And that sort of technology, I think, has reduced price dispersion within retailer. Across retailers, it's different. By the way, I know in the UK, those price comparison websites are used more, but I think in the rest of the world, we are not using that much, or at least Google Shopping has taken over most of the others. So it's a very valid point.
So we have time for one last question, possibly. Anyone would like to ask a final question?
Hi, so I'm Kang from University of Warwick. I'm thinking about consumer protection policies. For example, return policies. So for example, if you know that you can return a product, if you find another lower price, would that impact the result? Would that impact the differences between online retailers and offline retailers?
So I suspect it would, yes. It sometimes happens naturally that the retailers feel compelled to offer these price matching policy, sometimes with their own competitors, but often they tend to have it within their own outlets. No? I think Walmart has exactly that. And if you can show in a Walmart store, you can show the online price is different. They're just going to price match it on. And that automatically creates this type of single price behavior. So I think you're right. But I don't know if we need the laws to be in place. I'm just saying it's a natural behavior of the market, and the transparency of the web seems to be doing that anyway. You know?
Possibly time for one final question, as that was quite quick. So, Nick.
Nick Vaughan, ex-ONS. Alberto, thanks again for your presentation. Could you say a little bit about the role of the barcode in the app? And do you derive data from a lookup on the barcode? Is that public data? And perhaps thoughts on using the barcode, which is unique time invariance across retailers, and perhaps how you could build that into the ESCoE or something like that.
So yeah, that's a good point. When I've used this, I didn't need to know exactly what the good was. I didn't need to categorize it. So I just needed an indicator that was persistent over time, so I could measure at the good level the inflation rate. When you're thinking of classifying goods, the way we usually do it is when we get it online, we can get a detailed product description, and then we have machine learning algorithms that can classify it into a certain ESCoE category. Doing it offline is much harder because it's not so easy to capture that product information unless you could use because we are scanning actually the barcode. Well, you can decide what you scan, but you can scan the barcode of the product itself, the UPC. I don't know how it's called here in the UK. Maybe it's different, but it's the UPC code. Or you could even do the barcode on the price tag. But essentially, you would need to find another database that tells you the characteristics of the product. No? Because asking these freelancers for sure to input more than just a barcode, a price, and take a picture is going to be a lot more complicated. Yes. Particularly for the price of what we pay. Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the
Thank
insightful
you.
and helpful
Thank you.
presentation.